back, everyone, to another episode of Midnight Sports Today. Of course, I'm Brock, and I'm joined with a special guest of the show, Omar Borja. Now, of course, he has joined us on the Hawaii talk show, and then also I've jumped on his show multiple times to talk about Hawaii football as well. Today, we're going to talk about college football in general, more importantly, conference realignment. Obviously, the big news has come out. Before we get into all of that, Omar, how are you doing?
I'm doing good. It's a weekend. Got a nice few days off with this holiday weekend, so good time to recharge. But a lot going through. I mean, I'm just waiting. I just want answers with this whole realignment thing because there's a few things I hold near and dear to my heart. Bowl season, especially the Rose Bowl. So just waiting for all that, honestly.
Yeah, absolutely. You brought up a great point because historically, the Rose Bowl has been a matchup between the Pac-12 champion and the Big Ten champion, unless, of course, it is a college football playoff game. Now, two of the most participants for the Pac-12, the teams that have participated the most in the Rose Bowl, USC and UCLA, have both announced that they will be joining the Big Ten in the near future in athletics. Now, this is a big deal when it comes to football, as we all know. USC is the re-emerging powerhouse with Lincoln Riley, and UCLA is this offensive juggernaut with Chip Kelly. They're going obviously to the Big Ten. Geographically, it doesn't make sense at all. We can compare this to all the other moves, and we'll get that down the road. But first, what are your thoughts about UCLA and USC moving to the Big Ten?
I mean, so pretty much like I'd hate to like be hyperbolic in nature, but college football, as many have mentioned, is a regional game. It's a game that's very regional in nature. And some of the storylines too, whether it be the Pac-12s or I guess the constant struggles from the beginning of time of Pacific teams to get respect on the national scale, that's all due to regionalization. I mean, and now with UCLA and USC moving to the Big Ten, you sort of lose that bit of regionalization. You lose that storyline. You lose a lot of history and rivalries, even though the only rivalry that's been touched is like USC and UCLA. But I mean, that block of Pacific schools, with the exception of Utah and Colorado, have in some sense, actually with the exception of Utah, Colorado, Arizona, and Arizona State, those 8 schools have in some sense all played each other for the past century, that Pacific block school. So you lose that. You lose the regionalization of college football where like essentially the Big Ten in all essence is just like a pro league where, I mean, it's like a conglomerate of schools there accumulating money. I mean, yeah, you have your rivalries, but it's like no different in my eyes now. I see like, Minnesota, Iowa is no different than like Vikings, Packers, whatnot. So that's the first couple of thoughts in my mind where like college football is losing its character. And to be honest with you, if you want to see the true character of college football from now on, you'd either have to go watch the group of 5 and below FCS, Division 2, Division 3, because FBS is quickly becoming like, or the Power 5 is quickly becoming like a semi-pro league, honestly.
Absolutely. And of course, throughout the past decade, in the past 2 decades, we've seen a lot of shifts in college football. Of course, teams leaving conferences go to other conferences in chase of money, higher status, protections, things of that nature. But for the most part, they've maintained the regional aspect for what you mentioned. Of course, there was kind of some question marks when Nebraska decided to head up to the Big Ten, but at least Nebraska is in the Midwest, so it kind of makes a little bit of sense. Of course, the big announcement was Texas and Oklahoma moving to the SEC. Oklahoma is kind of like that southern Midwest area. Texas is that southern Midwest area as well. But they could get away with that a little bit due to the fact that A&M successfully moved to the SEC, and that still can be considered the South. Now you're talking about USC, UCLA having to play road games halfway across the country. That's almost unheard of to do on a weekly basis. You hit it on the head. Absolutely. We knew the money was gonna pull teams away. I never thought it was gonna be like this. I thought eventually the SEC would take up more teams, possibly advance more to the north, maybe take some of the southern ACC teams. Never did I ever think the Big Ten, if they were to expand, would go west. That's just something that we haven't heard of it ever. So definitely something to keep an eye out for the future. I want to compare the UCLA USC move to the Big Ten to the Texas Oklahoma move to the SEC. Which one do you think was better, more beneficial, and which move will work out for those schools in the long run?
So the thing is, so I guess from more logical, like you were absolutely right. You know, Oklahoma, Tennessee is more logical. It's hard to say who wins more because the Big 12 had a great amount of stability, I think, with those 10 teams that they had, even with Oklahoma and Texas, because Oklahoma and Texas were the anchors. As long as they stay, the Big 12 is going to stand pat. That being said, them like with them moving to the SEC being the catalyst for sort of like the decline of the Big 12, which we thought was going to happen until they added the 4 or the 3 schools in the American and BYU. You know, since Oklahoma and USC were the catalysts of that, I mean, can't really say that they're in like much present danger. And then you can say the same thing too about USC and UCLA. But when it comes to the disparity between the Big 10 and the Pac-12, I think this is a huge win money wise. I think USC and UCLA win money wise this move because you look at the Pac-12 in their in their upcoming media negotiations, excuse me, they're fighting hard to get out of that after dark slot, which I mean that's a slot all to themselves. The viewership isn't great in more optimal media markets in the Central and in the East, and they're trying to get out of that. And you look at the money. I mean, the Pac-12 is constantly at the bottom of the Power Five in terms of revenue. The Big Ten is by the top. And if you don't even look at the money, if you look at exposure, you look at Fox itself too. Like Fox, who also broadcasts both the Big Ten and the Pac-12, as we know. I mean, the Fox always gets. They always like almost put either if it wasn't an Oklahoma game or Texas game at noon, it was always a Big Ten game that was a big noon kickoff, and then 3:30 game was probably going to be another Big Ten game with like the night game being probably a Big 12 game. And whatnot. And if you look at ABC too for Saturday Night Football, ABC was only obligated to carry, I think, 1 or 2 primetime Pac-12 games. And even then, like you look at UCLA Oregon this past year, College Game Day was out there at the Rose Bowl with in Pasadena for that game. That was a 3:30 game on ABC. It wasn't even the night game on ABC. So I think USC and UCLA win more in terms of exposure. Travel hurts a lot, honestly, especially the Olympic sports schools or Olympic sports of those schools. I mean, you got like the women's volleyball teams and the soccer teams. They're gonna have to spend days out there in the Midwest, and that kind of hurts recruiting for those programs too. Which I mean, I'm not sure if they factored it in right away. If you tell a kid that okay, you get to go to school at USC, but in season you're gonna spend weeks in the Midwest, I don't think that's what they would have signed up for. So USC and UCLA win in short, but in terms of Olympic sports, I think USC and UCLA are going to face a drastic decline in recruiting.
Yeah, you bring up an excellent point when we talk about the rest of the sports besides football. I want to touch on basketball for a little bit as well because they're going to be playing on the road at Michigan, at Ohio State. You know, those are not easy environments to win in basketball. The jet lag is going to be a major issue for that. But that's basketball. Obviously, we're talking about football at the moment. Football is an outside sport, and the Big Ten, all the stadiums are outside. You know, USC, UCLA, they're gonna have to play night games or day games in the freezing cold. You know, I sent out a tweet basically saying that this move is all good and dandy until they lose in Bloomington because it's cold as hell outside. You know, there's a reason why Ohio State fans get nervous every time they play Purdue because it's just unexpected and Purdue has knocked them off so many times. Don't tell me weather doesn't play a part in that. You know, you guys are bringing kids already that have played their high school ball in California. Now they're going to continue to enjoy the California weather, which they should. But then you got to take them out of that pretty comfortable environment, throw them into the freezing cold of Columbus, Ohio, or Ann Arbor, Michigan, right, or East Lansing, Michigan. I just don't see how that's a beneficial move when you talk about building a championship schedule. Pac-12, it has enough prestige for you to get to the college football playoff if you go undefeated or if you have one loss and you win the conference title. And at the end of the day, the only thing that matters is national championships. So quite frankly, I understand the move from a money point, from a competitive point of view. It does not seem very smart at all, but we'll touch upon that move a little bit later. I want to touch upon conference realignment in general. What do you take of it? And do you think conference realignment works for college programs?
So I mean, I think on both ends it works because you have the good and the bad with anything. So the bad is what we're seeing now, where it's ultimately a money grab, traditions die, and there's a lot of people behind the scenes that are hurt by it. The good is what we saw in terms of Conference USA, in my opinion, where you have a school like New Mexico State or Liberty, schools that did not have football homes, and getting one with the chain of events. All it took was Texas, Oklahoma being disgruntled with their situations in the Big 12 for New Mexico State to stop doing the independent thing. Because I mean, I'm out here in El Paso. I've lived in New Mexico I've lived in Albuquerque, the Albuquerque Metro for since 2011, since 2011. And I know a lot about the New Mexico State program, how that stadium in Las Cruces, it's kind of isolated. The whole Las Cruces El Paso sort of corridor, it's isolated. It's hard to form a schedule, just to summarize it shortly. It's hard to recruit. Getting a conference, getting TV money, where New Mexico State was getting the games broadcasted by Flow Sports throughout their time as the independent. That's a victory for them because of conference realignment. But in this day and age, stories like that are so few and far between, where you hardly have any schools winning and truly bettering their positions without without money being the main focus. Like the two ones I can think of right now with bettering their situation are Louisville and TCU, teams that got out of the Power Five got out of the Group of Five and are in the Power Five now in their respective conferences and are competitive. And then now with like UCF, Houston, and Cincinnati and BYU for that matter, going to the Big 12, like those schools win. So but those stories are so few and far between in conference realignment. So that's just my viewpoint, where a few schools win, but mostly it's all about the money.
I want to disagree with that. I agree with most of it, but I want to bring up TCU and Louisville for a second. And the reason why is because when TCU was a member of the Mountain West, they won a Rose Bowl. And then they go to the Big 12, and they had some success in the beginning with Trayvon Boykin, I believe, at quarterback, and that really fun offense. Ranked number 2 in the nation at one point in time, but they never made a college football playoff, and they only have one Big 12 championship to their name, and that was a co-championship with Baylor, a team they lost to in that season. They've only made, I believe, one Big 12 championship game, a game in which they lost. And then for Louisville, at one point in time, they were going to make the national championship game when they were back in the Big East. Since they made their move to the ACC, I just haven't seen it from them. Of course, Lamar Jackson became a Heisman winner, but he also went like 8-5 in that season too, if I'm not mistaken. I just don't see conference realignment working for teams realigning. I mean, we can go down the list of every team. I wrote an article about it, but I just want to bring up a couple teams real quick. Nebraska they were in the Big 12 championship game every single season. They've only been to one Big 10 championship game, and they got blown out in it. Colorado, I think, only played in one, and they lost. Utah finally got over the hump, but they played in 3 other Pac-12 championship games, and they lost. And Utah hasn't won a New Year's Six bowl game since going to the Pac-12. Whereas when they were in the Mountain West, they won the Sugar Bowl over Alabama, and they also won the Fiesta Bowl over Pitt. At Texas A&M has never competed in an SEC championship game, has never made a college football playoff. I think the highest bowl win they've had in the SEC is the Cotton Bowl. Missouri surprisingly made 2 SEC championship games, but they lost both. I just don't see what's kind of the benefit. If you're chasing money, that's one thing. But if you're chasing championships, it just doesn't seem like the right recipe to win. And that's why I just don't see how this move could work out for USC or UCLA. And also, I don't see the move working out for Texas and Oklahoma. I don't care how many 5-star recruits you bring in. The game is won on the field. And until they're able to get over that hump, something I haven't seen yet, I just don't think that, again, this is a benefit for them. With that being said, Oregon is now the big question mark in the Pac-12. Obviously, they're Nike University, as we all know. They've been the 10,000 jerseys. What do you see happening with them next?
Right now, I mean, I'm hearing like one thing or another on like whether they're going to join the Big Ten or not. So it's like I honestly do not have an answer. Like I think part of me thinks that they do go to the Big Ten, but I'm hearing that Notre Dame needs to go first before they add Oregon and then Washington. So it's just like at this point, I'm not sure. If anything, I think the Big 12 should be on the phone with Oregon right now as we speak, because at the moment, the Big 12's got like a huge revenue advantage on the Pac 12. And I mean, the Big 12 can gain much from having Oregon. I mean, after all, like if we look strictly from a non-conference perspective this past season, Oregon did beat Ohio State at the Horseshoe this year. That would be the best non-conference win in the Big 12 as well, if I'm not mistaken, like this whole season. So I mean, they do have much to gain in adding Oregon in football, not just in football, but in basketball, men's and women's. I mean, the men's team has been solid for some time. The women's team recently had Sabrina Ionescu graduate. And then you have the track programs too. So there's a ton to I guess to benefit for the Big 12 from Oregon. But another concern is, of course, you had Oregon. I mean, then you have the travel question. West Virginia and Cincinnati get left out to dry. So it just seems with every solution that comes out, 1,000 more problems emerge in conference realignment. So that's kind of why I don't really have a projection for Oregon at the moment.
Got you. And I think differently when it comes to Oregon because obviously money is not a big issue for the program. Again, they're Nike U. I do think that obviously we both know that Notre Dame is kind of the key piece. Wherever they fall, that's like the next thing's going to be the domino effect. From what I've been hearing, the Big Ten isn't ready to make a move on any other team, especially until they find out what's happening at Notre Dame, because Notre Dame has so many tie-ins historically with Big Ten teams, but also currently with ACC schools as well. I do believe that Oregon's top priority is to keep their matchups with Oregon State, Washington State. They want to stay in that Pacific Northwest. They don't really want to do that whole travel thing. The Ohio State thing was a great win, but kind of fluky, especially when they lose. Especially when they have a really close win against Fresno State and then lose to Stanford. It was a really odd time for them. They do play Georgia this year, so if they beat them, that does change a lot of things in terms of prestige. I want to start going over what I think is going to happen in the future of college football. Now, as you know, and through our many discussions, I go out there with my ideas. I think that things are going to be bigger and huge, and they're probably less than what it is. But I honestly think this is the death of both the concept of the Power Five and the Group of Five. And the reason why I say that is because I think there's going to be a lot of consolidation. Now, the Pac-12's nearest conference is the Mountain West. And as we all know, the Mountain West is being picked apart for spare teams, as you can say. I think that there's a true possibility that the Southern programs of the Pac-12, Arizona State, I think they're going to leave for the Big 12. I think they could be joined by UTSA, UTEP, kind of consolidation of the remaining Texas teams, bring in Arizona, that try to boost the numbers as much as possible. You have your Utah connection with BYU. Obviously, now you have Cincy, UCF, Houston, so on and so forth. I also think that there's a lot of rumors going out that Utah and Colorado could look to join the Big 12. I don't see Colorado going back to the Big 12. It just doesn't seem like a move that makes sense for them, especially in the state of their program. Same thing with Utah. They seem more comfortable playing in the Pacific area and playing kind of in that general zone of where Utah is. I don't foresee them going out to Texas as much as people they would have to if they played in the Big 12. So when it comes to the Pac-12 and Mountain West, I think they could consolidate to one big super conference. And here's how I kind of wrote it out. So I think it's gonna be a 20-team conference. I think you have two divisions. I think here's what the divisions are gonna be. There's gonna be mostly the California schools. So Cal, Fresno State, San Jose State, San Diego State, Stanford. You're also gonna have Nevada teams, UNLV, UNR, then Hawaii because in that area. Wyoming because it's kind of like the odd piece at the moment. Wyoming's kind of iffy. I only put Wyoming in there because they have rivalry tie-ins with some of those other teams, and then New Mexico. And I also think that don't be shocked if Montana makes a jump into FBS consideration, and then they join that super conference as well. Now going to the other side is kind of the consolidation of Pacific Northwest, Washington State, Oregon State, Boise State, right there, of course, Oregon, Washington, Idaho, and then Colorado State, Air Force, being that they're all in the state of Colorado, Utah State, again, because they're right there, and then Eastern Washington, I could see making the FBS jump as well. Of course, they have a very exciting offense, a god-awful field. That red thing is just horrible to look at. But I think Montana and Eastern Washington, being the powerhouses that they are, could be looking to make the jump to the FBS level. What do you think about that, Omar?
Right now, I just don't think many other teams jump to. I don't think the Mountain West looks for well, excuse me. I think they look for a couple FCS schools. Um, as to who, the pool is just so wide. I mean, Eastern Washington makes sense. Montana makes sense as well. Maybe North Dakota State. I would think those three are on the top list too. But it's hard for me to see Montana making a jump without Montana State there in tow, with the Brawl of the Wild being the rivalry it is. Honestly, but I mean, it's realignment, rivalries get broken. I think consolidation, as people have hinted for years, is the model that we might be going towards. And I feel like with one thing, if we do consolidation, I think there should be relegation with that consolidation, honestly. A soccer style. If there's a way to keep it working with the bowl system and everything where you have that relegation, then let's make it happen. Excuse me. But I mean, yeah, like I'm just not so sure at the moment, like what teams like from the FCS would be willing to make the jump. I do think if there's teams that we're going to target, that we're going to pinpoint as teams ready to make the jump, I think you have to look at the teams that were in the conversations with Conference USA when Conference USA was being poached earlier this or well, yeah, in the fall of 2021. I mean, that would be schools such as Eastern Kentucky was in the conversation. Tarleton State has hinted that they're on their way up. I know that their defensive coordinator made a tweet that implied that they're going to move up. I mean, I would look at teams like that as like, I guess better locks for who's going to move up. But I mean, it'll be interesting to see what the Pac-12 does. I mean, it's sensible that they do reach in the Mountain West. I have San Diego State and Boise State in mind. Whether they do a consolidation model with all the schools in the West, I mean, maybe, but yeah, there's just so many possibilities that can be made. It's like, we can sit here for hours to discuss that.
Yeah, and the reason why I said that is because I think the Mountain West is a very intelligent conference, and they've been ahead of the game in a lot of things for a very long time. And what really helped them grow was capitalizing on the demise of the WAC. Now, the WAC in the late 2000s was actually throughout the 2000s was balling. Of course, they had Derek Carr, no, sorry, his brother David Carr at Fresno State. They were really popular. Of course, the run and shoot for Hawaii was really popular. Boise State became the kind of figurehead for the conference. Obviously, winning the 2006 Fiesta Bowl, Hawaii making the 2007 Sugar Bowl, Boise State then going to play in the 2009 or 2010 Fiesta Bowl. At one point in the 2010 season, Boise State was like the number 2 team in the nation. If they beat Nevada, they would have been in the national championship game. And even with all that prestige, the conference crumbled. So that's why I think the Mountain West might lean towards prestige. That relegation system is definitely something to look at a lot. You have talked about a lot on Twitter, the bowl tie-ins and how realignment affects that. I want to get more of your in-depth thoughts about that.
Yeah, so I mean, it's interesting because I think the one way that college football has been wrong in going about a playoff was an amazing idea, 14 playoff. I mean, it was long overdue. But the way that college football went about it and in partnering with its lead television partner, ESPN, college football has become the playoff, which is very wrong. I mean, the essence of bowl season is let's go back in time. I guess like to when there was like 5 or 10 bowls. The essence of bowl season was you take teams that had great seasons and you give them pretty much a free vacation at the end of December/beginning of January. And that was that. I mean, local communities came together to watch these games, and they're exhibitions in essence, and they still are exhibitions. Now ESPN has become, with emphasizing with it being the playoff and nothing else, these bowls become meaningless. That meaning, that original meaning that I just mentioned, it's lost in everything. It's just TV inventory for ESPN, who owns almost all of bowl season. There's no diversity. There's no network diversity or TV network diversity in the bowl season. And the essence and the glory of bowls have been lost, honestly. So, I mean, that's one part of the whole bowl thing. I mean, people say like, bowls are meaningless. They obviously didn't see Chad Lunsford, taking a knee, crying on the field at the 2018 Camellia Bowl when Tyler Bass kicked game-winning field goal against Eastern Michigan. Like glorious moments like that define what bowl season is. And I mean, now the bowl, I mean, this is all happening. Like people are losing track. Like, maybe I love bowls too much, but like the bowl cycle it ends in 2025. We don't get new bowl tie-ins or new bowls into the fold until 2025. So that's why we have a bunch of wonky tie-in, like a bunch of like wonky sort of like tie-in numbers, like Conference USA having 7 tie-ins and the Sun Belt only having 5 for the rest of this bowl cycle. Lord knows what happens to the Big Ten, like how many like what bowls they'll be sending their teams to, because they're going to have 16 teams and they might have 18 or 20 teams when this is all said and done. So it's just a confusing time for bowls as well. And we might be seeing, I don't want to be defeatist, because I think like for me to say this would be leaping too far forward into the future with all these events. But I mean, bowls have to have an answer pretty much soon as to like what they're going to do, honestly, because a lot of these bowls are becoming not really intersectional matchups like they were originally intended to be, back when there were 5 or 10 bowls. So that's really getting lost in the circuit. Like what happens with college football's postseason, this could have huge ramifications for college football's postseason in the future.
Absolutely. And before, obviously, the national championship was the goal for every program. But realistically, we knew that there would only be a handful of programs that could compete. But that number was still pretty large, right? At least 20 to 25 teams you figured had a legit shot at a national championship. And of course, the BCS bowl games, Sugar, Fiesta, Rose, and Orange were always the big ones. Then you had the smaller tiers, so on out, so on forth. It was a good time. And then the playoff happens, and Kirk Herbstreit made a comment this season at the Rose Bowl when Chris Olave and Garrett Wilson decided to opt out. And basically, he was questioning their love and devotion to the game. And the reason why I hate that comment so much is because Herbstreit is a member of College Game Day who emphasizes the bowl rankings all season long, even before the first game of the season. Everyone's talking about who's the top four. Everyone's making their own top 4 leading up to the first release of the rankings. And then when a team doesn't make a national championship, it's like, what is the point anymore? Now, personally, if I had the opportunity, I wouldn't have sat out the Rose Bowl. But I'm just a big fan of the Rose Bowl. Had it been the Fiesta Bowl, I can't say I wouldn't have sat out if I was in that position either. Why should these guys risk millions of dollars to play in a game when the people that run college football have basically determined it to be meaningless at this point? I don't understand. I've been a big fan of playoff expansion for a long time, but at the end of the day, no one is gonna opt out of competing for a championship. No one has ever opted out of playing in the college football playoff. That has never happened. It never will happen. And until we give those bowls the importance again, I just think that these teams, when they go and they realign themselves, they don't care. Because if they're not competing for a national championship, what's the point of caring about all these other things? And that's kind of like my viewpoint on it. Obviously, I'm a big fan of bowl season. You are too. It's really fun to see the teams that would never play each other play each other. It's not every day you see Auburn versus Houston, right? Like last year, and then Houston ends up smoking Auburn, which is even crazier. I just think that it's just there's a death happening in college football. Not the death of college football, but the death of what it was. It's happened before, so I'm not trying to be over dramatic about it. But it's kind of sad to see these programs value money over competing for a title, especially in an environment where players are getting chastised for putting their money over what could be the better fit for them. That's all I have to say about that. But with the consolidation of these conferences and the realignment, I have suggested a 16-week, 15-game season instead of obviously the 12 games that teams play now. What I think should happen is essentially week 1 you can play whoever you like, or week 0 you can play whoever you like. Play some random FCS school, whatever. And then week 2, I think, should be rivalry week, where essentially teams that are in different conferences renew their long-standing rivalries. For example, Michigan and Notre Dame, Miami and Florida, North Carolina, South Carolina, Penn State, Pitt. so Tennessee versus Virginia Tech, so on and so forth. One that I would really like to see personally is TCU versus Utah, kind of a throwback to the old Mountain West Conference days. What do you think about that?
I mean, I like that idea. I mean, I'm not sure if the 12 game season is sustainable. I mean, when you said 15 game season, it was kind of like nails on a chalkboard because my first thought is like, what's gonna happen to Army Navy? You know, the cap of the college football season. I don't see the American sort of, I guess, becoming a mega conference, with Navy there, but it's like you have more games, which I mean, it seems like it's going to be necessary to have more games. It's like Army Navy is not going to be a standalone game anymore, which, that's I'm part of a small interest group, here thinking of that game and wanting it to be a standalone game. That's like my first thought about that. I mean, I'm all for rivalries though, like non-conference rivalries. It's just like the schools have too much pride, honestly. Whether it's like Penn State, Pitt, the backyard brawl, which thankfully is returning this year. What else? Texas A&M, Texas. Like I just think pride gets in the way of renewing those old standing rivalries.
Yeah, I agree, and I don't think Army Navy gets touched because it's so ingrained in American culture, especially since that it's like the only game on TV when they play. So I don't worry about that. But you do bring a good point. Like what could happen with like Navy Air Force, because that game isn't as well watched as Army Navy for a multitude of reasons. Could the Commander in Chief's trophy not exist anymore? I think that's something that people really gotta look at. But again, we just kind of have to see how it plays out. Final question of the night before we go. Let's pretend it's 10 years down the road, and let's look at Texas, Oklahoma, USC, and UCLA. Do you think any of them have a conference championship in the next 10 years?
Yeah, I guess before I answer that, I mean to answer your concerns about the Commander in Chief's trophy. I think because the name implies it has much bigger meaning. I think that one is safe to. I was more worried about like it being a standalone game, but I guess Army Navy in the future may have to share airtime with the rest of the FBS slate, which the game's being played at the end of the season. It's fine. It sucks that it's not a standalone, but that's just, the meat and potatoes that are on our plate. We'll have to eat them. So, with that being said, to answer your question, with them having a conference title, I mean, I think a lot of people are saying that, like, yeah, USC won't be able to deal with, the strong run games of the Big Ten, and it's like if we think about like it's like what teams still play that pro style type of offense, with a fullback running down your throat. The two that I can think of right now are Wisconsin and Iowa, of course. The third one being Michigan, and it's like you look at what success they've had in the like on the playoff scale. Like, yes, those are very solid programs, but we saw Iowa this past year, ride the coattails of an amazing defense. But the moment that Aiden O'Connell started throwing the ball to David Bell, they folded on national TV. Like they just folded, you know. So it's like maybe it's like as much as I hate to say it, being a fullback connoisseur, a lover of running schemes like Iowa's and Wisconsin's, maybe it's time that we come to the realization that it's like, I mean, it's not as scary as it is. Like having a pro style offense like isn't as scary as like we make it seem in regards to like a USC. USC's defense, it's like Swiss cheese at the moment, but that's not to say they can get better. I mean, that's not to say like, at the end of the day, like with the system Lincoln Riley's going to run, like teams in the Big Ten are going to get behind. And, teams like Wisconsin, Iowa, Michigan even aren't really geared to like come from behind, honestly. Heck, I'll even throw Michigan State this past year after they had the worst passing defense in the country. And we saw what happened against Ohio State. They got behind and, Kenneth Walker ended with only like 8 carries, I think. And they just got blown out because that wasn't their game. So I think USC is more set up for success. UCLA is interesting because we're seeing the pieces get put together like this past year, and I really wanted to see the Holiday Bowl last year against NC State because I thought that would have been such a great measuring stick for that program. Unfortunately, that game got canceled, but I think USC or UCLA is kind of in a position where they're a sleeping giant right now, where Chip Kelly's offense is really clicking, especially with a senior DTR, with a 5th-year DTR. I mean, that's honestly going to be scary this year. Now that being said, they've generally been in less of a position money wise than USC. Like they're both loaded with money, but USC has always had the competitive advantage. I just don't know if UCLA will be able to win a conference championship. I'm not saying like, and I'm not saying that USC will be a dynasty in the Big Ten. I just think that we're thinking that USC may not have as much. Well, like I said, we're thinking that USC may not have as much of an upward trajectory as they should, honestly. And UCLA, I think their ceiling's a bit lower than USC, but a couple wins, they shouldn't have in a season could have them in a position to be like an Iowa or a Wisconsin. But I guess to put in short, I mean they'll struggle at first, but I don't think they'll struggle as much as like we think they will.
What do you think about Oklahoma and Texas?
Oklahoma and Texas, sorry. Yeah, sorry, that question was multifaceted, Brock, my bad. But yeah, I think Texas and Oklahoma, I mean, first Nick Saban and Kirby Smart have to leave the SEC because they got a stranglehold on that conference. And I don't see them having really a down year where, I guess Texas or Oklahoma ends up winning their divisions. Maybe Oklahoma beats Alabama one year, but I see Oklahoma slipping up another week in conference play, where it being kind of like an Auburn thing. Whenever Auburn would beat Alabama in the season, well, they had a couple losses to a couple other teams that kind of spoiled them from playoff contention. But I mean, I think their paths are easier than USC and UCLA's. Actually, no, I think they're actually harder. Honestly, they're harder than USC and UCLA's because you have Auburn. You have Alabama, you have Georgia. There's also Auburn, who has great years too. There's also LSU. I mean, who knows what Brian Kelly has up his sleeve at LSU. There's also Florida too, with Billy Napier and whatnot. If Florida can put together a whole season, they're a playoff contender. I mean, we've seen flashes of them looking like the best team in the country in recent years. Let's see. I mean, there's another school I want to mention too as well. Let's see, Florida is an SEC East. I'm not going to say Kentucky, even though Kentucky's on the rise too, but that's another program that you can have an off game against. Say LSU, Oklahoma, Texas.
Yeah, there's also Ole Miss, Mississippi State.
Yes, that's what I would have mentioned. Yeah, Lane Kiffin. Yeah, Lane Kiffin too. I mean, he looks like he's in the prime of his coaching career at Ole Miss. So I think the path is honestly hard for Oklahoma and Texas.
Yeah, I agree with that assessment as well. I think for Oklahoma, it's a little bit easier because they have recent success, and the head coach is arguably the best defensive mind in college football. So that does help a little bit. For USC, UCLA, obviously UCLA hasn't competed in a championship game in a little bit. And they haven't won a Pac-12 championship in a long, long time. USC is a little bit different. They won one under Clay Helton. But honestly, the Sam Darnold years were very fluky in an era of really bad play by the Trojans. The issue I have for USC when it comes to UCLA when it comes to making a championship game is the fact that, if they play a team like Wisconsin or Iowa in September or October, they're going to blow them out. There's no doubt about it, whether they play in California or they play on the road. However, when the weather gets a little colder and it gets a little harder to throw, and you got to be able to come up and consistently take the bruising that Iowa or Wisconsin or Michigan can lay on you, can you handle that? I mean, it's not easy to constantly get blasted in the cold. And then at the same time, do they have the experience and the mental toughness to, surpass that? I don't know. That's why I think it's going to be a little bit harder for USC, UCLA to do it because Lincoln Riley is an intelligent man. But there's some things you can't out scheme. Weather plays a big factor. Michigan, all they did was literally pull their guards every play against Ohio State, and that ran them all the way to a playoff spot. I just don't see it happening for USC or UCLA, even though USC has Lincoln Riley. Chip Kelly against teams that are not on the West Coast is very, very bad. It's happened his entire career. And lastly, I just want to add when it comes to Oklahoma and Texas, more, I guess, Oklahoma. Can they finally put the pieces together on defense? Right? And if they can, obviously they'll be great. But if they can't, they're going to be horrible. However, the defensive coordinator at Oklahoma in the Lincoln Riley days is at USC. So if Oklahoma is able to finally build a defense within the next 2-3 years, one has to beg the question, why couldn't Lincoln Riley and his staff do it in his 5 years down in Norman? That's kind of the big question for me is USC will go as far as Oklahoma doesn't. If Oklahoma massively improves, there's no way USC wins a conference championship. Whereas if Oklahoma stays stagnant, maybe there was another factor of why they couldn't get over the hump. That's kind of my arguments for the day. Omar, thank you so much for coming on the show. Do you have anything to say before we head out?
Oh no, Brock. Thanks for having me. Really appreciate it. And I mean, we'll just wait and see. Honestly, like that's, it's. I just think we're past the point. This realignment is so wild that we're past the point where like we can just say like, oh man, like make our own scenarios because the situation just evolves so quick. Like, but I really appreciate you coming, like you having me on your podcast, and I'm on the edge of my seat. This is the blockbuster of the summer. This conference realignment.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, we will be talking with Omar again come later on this year for sure when it comes to bowl season, because that's something we're both very passionate about. Thank you for everyone who tuned in. We'll get back to you with more info as more things come out in college football. All right, everyone. Have a good one.